I promise you I never imagined that a simple sheet hidden in the sleeve of a uniform would change an entire case that seemed closed. I am Dr. Adrian Cifuentes, a forensic expert here in San Jose, Costa Rica, and today I'm going to tell you how a detail as small as a folded sheet between the seams made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about that body. It all started at a scene that seemed routine, a body dressed in a flawless uniform, without a single stain, without clear signs of violence. The usual procedure in these cases is to identify the cause of death, check personal belongings, talk to witnesses. But when I went to perform the autopsy, something unexpected appeared. When I rolled back the sleeve, I found that folded sheet. It wasn't a farewell letter nor a personal note, but a technical maintenance record. Yes, maintenance. Something that no one on the team had noticed or considered relevant. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. But what was written there had a note that broke everything we had understood about the case. A date, a code, a detail indicating that the clothing had undergone a lesser-known intervention, possibly related to the scene itself. It was like discovering a secret door, just when we thought the case was completely closed. The body, that central piece, was not just that, it was a living archive, memory, and message. And that small clue in the sleeve, invisible to most, was desperately asking to be heard. It radically changed the conclusion of the case and reminded me that sometimes the most important evidence is not where we usually look for it. In this video, I'm going to take you step by step through what triggered that tremendous revelation, how that forgotten sheet in the fabric ended up being the key to understanding something much deeper than a simple death in uniform, a mystery where the truth was literally in the sleeve. Are you ready? Let's go to as I reached out to carefully pull the folded sheet from between the seams. I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if the body before me was holding a secret the rest of the world wasn't yet ready to hear. It was an old paper, yellowed at the edges, clearly something that had been there for quite some time, but had gone unnoticed by the previous investigative team. It wasn't a letter or a personal note, but a technical document with lists of codes, dates, and a series of annotations that at first seemed meaningless, until I realized it was a maintenance log. Maintenance? Of what? I wondered as I scrutinized every line, every word. At first, it seemed irrelevant, but one annotation immediately caught my attention. Pressure verifier, including alternate checker device, April 20th, 23, operational unit C4. That was strange, because the uniform the body wore indicated he belonged to the General Services staff, and that unit, C4, was known for being involved in special operations within the city's critical infrastructure. I couldn't help but think about the connection between that simple piece of paper and the man lying on the autopsy table. How had that sheet ended up in the sleeve of the uniform? And what did the reference to Unit C4 mean? It was a small fragment that didn't fit the initial narrative of the case file. As I concentrated, something began to ignite my professional instinct, the one that had saved me more than once. I took the sheet and searched the rest of the body for any other clues that might complement that piece of information. Nothing visible, no signs of premortem wounds, no tattoos, no documents nearby, but the uniform had a peculiarity. The fabric appeared recently repaired and had very subtle stains of a white powder, which at first I thought was dirt, but then recalled that this compound was sometimes used to mark sensitive areas on electronic equipment. Everything started to slowly fit together. I decided to review the security footage from the area where the body was found. The area was near a water treatment plant, a place that, interestingly, was also under the supervision of Unit C4. The cameras showed a man approaching briskly, carrying a bag that seemed to contain sophisticated electrical equipment. I noticed the clothing, the same uniform as the one in the morgue. The footage cut off just as the subject entered the restricted facilities. It was clear my victim was not just any janitor, but someone who had access to sensitive areas, someone who probably knew much more than the initial police report suggested. What if that maintenance log was a clandestine diary, some kind of coded logbook, a literal and figurative ace up the sleeve? I began deciphering the notes more carefully. Each date corresponded to minor incidents reported at the plant, but the margin note saying, "Do not inform superiors," was in smaller print, almost like a whispered instruction. Then I remembered an alert I had received weeks earlier about unauthorized attempts to tamper with the potable water distribution system. Everyone thought it was technical problems or minor sabotage, but nothing concrete came from those reports. What if he had discovered something more serious? Something that made him a target of hidden threats? With that thought, I ordered a chemical analysis of the white stains on the fabric. The results came the next day and confirmed my suspicions. It was a highly corrosive compound used for industrial sabotage, but applied carefully to leave no visible evidence. This meant someone had tried to destroy evidence on his uniform, to erase parts of his story, perhaps even prevent his true identity or actions from being revealed. The more I investigated, the more convinced I became that this man was a key piece in a plot that went beyond a simple accident or natural death. I recalled the victim had no criminal record or links to crimes, but he did have something important: an internal complaint file at the company where he worked, pointing out irregularities at the treatment plant, a file that mysteriously vanished from the database just after his death. This was a perfectly orchestrated puzzle, a shadow game where every move had dangerous consequences. I felt trapped between questions and silences, as if each new piece of data only opened more doors to a labyrinth of conspiracies and cover-ups. The following night, reviewing the photos of the corpse once more, I noticed something that escaped initial view: a faint mark on the right wrist, barely perceptible, but that seemed to correspond to a tracking device. Had he been protected or watched? Who had placed it there, and for what purpose? I went to the treatment plant to understand the scale of the place. Among the large tanks and industrial pipes, I felt an invisibly heavy presence. The truth hidden amid the constant noise of water and machines, a truth waiting for someone to rescue from silence. I returned to the office, where the IT team awaited me for an exhaustive analysis of electronic records. There, amid lines of code and deleted messages, something disturbing appeared: a chain of encrypted communications among several employees, including the victim, describing critical failures in the purification system capable of contaminating the water supply, with the intention of blaming subordinate operators and thus diverting responsibility. It was a Machiavellian move. And now I understood much better the role of that record in the sleeve, that folded sheet that seemed insignificant, but was actually the silent testimony of a man who had tried to fight from within, documenting everything to protect a city oblivious to the danger lurking beneath the surface of its daily life. The body, this time, ceased to be just biological evidence and became a living archive. Every feature, every object attached to the skin, told a story, a hidden message that forced me to look beyond the cold scientific method, to seek the truth among words, symbols, and silences. Sitting in the office, with the dim light of the monitor illuminating my tired eyes, I understood the scope of the risk this case entailed. It wasn't just a death but a warning, an urgent call to unravel a network of power, corruption, and environmental risk, with implications that could affect thousands of lives. That made me think, not only about the function of my work, but also about the human fragility hidden behind every case file, every uniform, every body found. Sometimes, finding the truth is like looking for a needle in a haystack, but that little sheet peeking from the seams, a simple folded letter, was a key that opened a door no one had supposed existed. And as the night advances and the morgue silence becomes almost complicit, I know this case will mark a before and after in my professional life, because I learned that it's not enough just to look or touch. You have to know how to listen to what the body wants to say, understand the message it hides, and be willing to follow it, even if that means venturing into shadows others prefer to ignore. Forensic analysis had its own rhythm, sometimes slow, other times fast, but never unpredictable. At that moment, with a pile of disordered pieces in front of me, I began to realize that every detail, no matter how small it seemed, was part of a network far more complex than anyone had imagined. I looked again at the photograph of the tracking device on the wrist, a tiny piece that seemed ridiculous for someone with access to such delicate areas. I wondered if that mark had gone unnoticed by the initial investigation team for ignoring what they considered insignificant, or if they really had found it but decided to dismiss it. One thought troubled me. What if that device had been placed to monitor the victim? Or worse, what if it had been part of a system of blackmail or threats? The face paled in my memory. That kind of surveillance is not used on ordinary employees, but on people close to something someone wants to protect at all costs. I felt like I was stepping onto a minefield, where every step had to be calculated because I was not facing a simple case of unexpected death. There was much more beneath the surface of that pristine uniform, of that body standing before me. Several hours passed as I consulted with specialists in industrial technology, trying to understand the specific implications of the notes I discovered on the hidden sheet. Every phone call led me to new connections, more names, pieces of a puzzle that seemed to have no edges. Unit C4, that operational group responsible in manuals for the security of critical infrastructure, was directly involved. And not only that, somehow those operations were being manipulated or sabotaged from within. The idea of sabotage intended to jeopardize the potable water supply of San Jose made my adrenaline spike, but also my fear. What haunted me was how that man fit into all of this. The body before me remained silent, unable to explain the full truth in words. So, I began to explore his surroundings more thoroughly. I reviewed work records, personal and work phone calls, court-ordered intercepted text messages, and social media. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I found something curious. A profile on a professional network revolving around engineering and industrial security. That account seemed parallel to his public life and contained quarterly documents related to the treatment plant, reports detailing anomalous situations and suggesting unauthorized interventions. The profile was viewed by very few people, and most of his contacts were connected to subcontracted companies with low levels of scrutiny. I began reading those documents carefully. They spoke of cultural failures, monitoring systems that were not working properly, but also mentioned specific people with names and positions. Among them, a plant manager whose name appeared again and again as a possible person responsible for hiding incidents. That led me to think about the economic interests behind the scene. In a city where potable water is a vital resource, any manipulation of the system could have direct consequences on thousands of people and on multi-million-dollar contracts. The murder no longer appeared to be an isolated act, but rather a move to protect powerful interests. What surprised me most was the last section of the record hidden in his sleeve. A list of email addresses and phone numbers, many assigned to the public and private sectors, presumably contacts to report irregularities or informants to report sabotage. Among them, a highlighted number, altered with red ink, that seemed like a code. I tried to decipher it with several keys, thinking it could be a simple encryption system. The result was clearly a hidden message. Maximum alert. Do not trust the system. Immediate action. That message implied urgency, a level of alarm that should not be publicized. However, this man had decided to keep that information hidden, literally stuck to his body. It was not a coincidence. It was a conscious act of leaving evidence in a final move. He had taken the risk of dying with that proof hidden among his clothes, almost like a legacy intended for someone who could understand it. I felt the weight of that legacy on my shoulders. I understood that the body before me, silent and solemn, represented something much greater, a stifled scream, a desperate attempt to reveal the truth in a hostile environment, hidden among bribes, threats, and complicities. My next step was to review the chain of command within the plant. The administrative investigation was complicated and full of resistance. Some people seemed willing to cooperate, but others closed ranks with a loyalty that smelled of fear or malicious interests. Amid all that, I couldn't help but feel we were treading on dangerous ground. There was no room for mistakes. The following days, I lived with the tension of someone with one hand extended toward the truth, but the other on the guard of an invisible weapon. I met with experts in industrial security and poisoning analysis to better understand the white stains on the uniform. The compound was rare, not only corrosive but used in small quantities to incapacitate electronic components without damaging visible structures. This made me think of attacks aimed at monitoring equipment, a tactic to silence alarms or disable systems detecting faults. It was a covert war, an invisible battle where projectiles were not bullets but chemicals and hidden data. My victim had been at the center of that storm without knowing it, or worse, had wanted to face it alone. Field investigation also led me to speak with the deceased's co-workers and family. I discovered a meticulous, responsible man who had repeatedly reported failures and threats, but who had also received explicit warnings to keep silent. His family feared for their lives, and some colleagues expressed a mixture of admiration and fear, as if they trusted him but preferred to stay on the sidelines. He was a lone hero, the silent watcher trapped in a game where the rules were written by others. One morning, while reviewing materials in my office, I received an anonymous email. It contained only a blurry, partially cropped image of damaged industrial equipment inside the plant with an encrypted message. Time is running out. Silence is a price. That confirmed my worst fears. There were forces willing to protect their secrets at all costs and had probably been tracking my every move. At that moment, I realized I couldn't act alone. My work as a forensic specialist is to unravel the truth in the body, but to solve this case, I needed allies outside the morgue. Investigative journalists, public safety experts, and even prosecutors willing to challenge bureaucracy. We began forming a small circle of trust, exchanging information, scrutinizing every lead rigorously, while the shadow of danger grew around us. But the most unsettling thing was not just a physical risk, but the feeling that we were about to expose a pot of corruption that went beyond the plan itself, reaching high political and business levels, where committing to the truth meant facing powerful enemies. I remember one night when, tired and with a crowded mind, I sat on my apartment balcony staring at the darkened city lights. I thought of that man, his silent fight, and the discreet sheet hidden in his sleeve that had changed everything. It was a reminder that the true work of a forensic specialist does not end with the autopsy. Death is just a starting point, a door to secret worlds revealed only to those willing to look beyond the obvious. The body spoke, in its own way, leaving testimonies no official report wanted or could hear. In his uniform, folded among the fabric, was a story much bigger than a simple death, a warning about a dangerous system, a denunciation of latent corruption, and an urgent call to action before the next accident is not just an isolated incident, but a massive tragedy. Thinking about that chilled my blood, yet I felt that strange mix, sometimes experienced by those of us who work with death, a deep reason to keep going, to dig into the shadows, and give voice to those who no longer can. My most revealing case was far from over, and that note in the sleeve, that folded, forgotten sheet, was my only guide in a dark labyrinth where every step had to be cautious but decisive. Because somehow, that body demanded a commitment from me, an act of justice that went beyond medical truth to human truth, the one that hurts, that unsettles, and which only a few are willing to face. The following days passed amidst breaches and closed doors, as if every step toward the truth caused discomfort to someone too important. I began to notice, unable to avoid it, that certain files became inaccessible just when I needed them, emails disappeared, and conversations suddenly ended abruptly. There was a pattern of bureaucratic resistance that I knew was no coincidence. Deep down, it was telling me that those who had the power to hide things could do so effectively and without leaving visible traces. It was then that I understood I would have to go far beyond the official sphere to unravel what was really happening. I re-examined with magnifying glass everything I found on the hidden page, that silent letter that had become the beacon of my investigation. There was a section I had never analyzed in depth. Some notes in the margins, almost illegible, as if written in a moment of haste or extreme anxiety. I decided to send those fragments to a cryptography expert in case it was another level of code, a kind of secret language among those who might be involved in that sabotage network. The results took a couple of days, but when they arrived, they left me stunned. It was not only a key to decipher internal messages, but also apparently used to assign resources and responsibilities covertly, something like an internal map to control movements and ensure that certain errors never got published officially. That discovery made me realize the case was even bigger than I feared. The victim was not just a technician or a labor engineer. He had been a fundamental link in a chain of information that someone wanted to break at any cost. Diagnosing that made me feel a mixture of admiration and sadness for the man lying there. His need to protect that data at all costs spoke to an unbreakable level of commitment, but also to a terrible loneliness. He was alone, without allies within a corrupt and dangerous system. The next revelation came when I decided to do something unusual. Combine forensic technique with sociology. I analyzed the victim's work and social environment from a more human perspective, looking for motivations, fears, and inadvertent allies. Interviews with his colleagues, which at first were evasive and contentious, began to open up little by little when I spoke to them without fear, without judgment, just listening. That's how I learned there was a hidden support network, made up of people who could not speak officially, but were willing to share fragments of truth confidentially. Among them, one voice was especially clear and firm, a young engineer whose fear mixed with determination. She confirmed that the plant had suffered suspicious technical failures, and that there had been pressures to silence incidents. She revealed names that matched those noted in the hidden document, connecting names with movements, economic decisions, and environmental risks. Each time a link connected, I felt increasing pressure. The more I discovered, the clearer the magnitude of the risk faced by all citizens became. The idea that the plan had not only suffered sabotage, but that there was a deliberate plan to hide it and manipulate the system set off an alarm inside me. This was not just a forensic or criminal investigation, but about protecting lives, about preventing a disaster. It was at that point that anonymous messages and threats intensified. Not only professionals, but my own family began to notice strange looks, strangers asking about me, unanswered late-night calls. I had crossed an invisible threshold. On an especially tense night, days after receiving a new encrypted message with the phrase, "Time is running out," I understood that the clock was against us. I sat alone in the dim light of my office, letting thoughts pile up and struggling to stay calm. I knew my findings compromised not just a company or a water plant. They touched powerful political interests and corruption networks that used dirty methods to protect themselves. And yet, I felt compelled to move forward. It all depended on my ethical and professional commitment. I thought of that body, of that forgotten letter in its sleeve, and of its hidden message. Now, that letter was no longer just another testimony. It was my key to the truth, but it was also, perhaps, my sentence. We organized clandestine meetings with local journalists, experts in environmental monitoring technology, and some brave prosecutors. Sharing the information with them meant risking a lot. It had to be done with caution and precision. But I also felt relief in opening the door to transparency, because even the clearest evidence cannot live if it remains locked away on a single desk. The feedback was swift and forceful. The 3 reports a victim had generated, which until then had been ignored or disappeared, contained devastating data. They indicated that the treatment plant suffered infiltrations of toxic substances that could contaminate key reserves, and there had also been illegal attempts to tamper with alarm systems to hide these failures. The damage was not only technical, but an attack on public health. An unexpected event shattered the stability of the investigation. One day, in the middle of reviewing documents, I received an urgent call from an anonymous contact inside the plant. "You have to leave. It's not safe for you to stay there." That warning forced me to impose a strict security protocol for my family and myself. But it caused something else inside me. It awakened a survival instinct I had never before felt so close. I understood that what we were touching was not just professional or scientific matter. It was a dividing line between justice and impunity, between those fighting for transparency and those who wanted to maintain control with cold blood. Under those circumstances, I couldn't help thinking of the deceased man's face. I had scrutinized him deeply for clues, but now it seemed to me he had left us much more than documents and encrypted messages. He had planted the seed of an ethical rebellion, the testimony of a life dedicated to doing something right in a rotten environment. His silent courage was now a beacon guiding us through the darkness, even though the shadow of the threat grew ever darker. The physical autopsy and scientific investigation had only been the starting point. What followed was a minefield of lies, betrayals, and complicated silences that defied all logic. However, amid that storm, there was a thread of hope. More and more people joined our circle, supporting from different angles. Journalists publishing reports with technical backing, lawyers building solid cases, activists generating public pressure. The pressure began to rise, and official responses, though slow and wary, could no longer ignore the volume of evidence we brought to light. Parallel investigations opened, and for the first time, I felt the scales could tip toward justice, even if only a little. Then I remember a phrase a colleague had told me after a tense meeting. "We're not just exhuming bodies or naming names. We're burying impunity and awakening consciences." That idea accompanied me every night when exhaustion overcame me and uncertainty lurked. Because in the end, that letter hidden in the sleeve was not just a lost document. It was a voice of a man who dared to challenge the system, the restrained cry of thousands afraid to speak, and the irrefutable proof that even in death, the truth can prevail if there is someone willing to listen. But I also knew the story did not end here. We had barely scratched the surface of an iceberg that threatened to sink us all if we didn't act with caution and courage, if we didn't bring to light every hidden piece. The responsibility, I felt, was enormous, but it was also a call impossible to ignore. The death of that man had ignited a flame that now burned intensely, and no matter how much they tried to extinguish it, I would have to keep going until it became a fire that forever changed how we viewed safety, justice, and truth in our society. So, while the city slept, unaware of the imminent danger, I was there, with a letter in my sleeve as my only ally, ready to keep unraveling the story that a silent body entrusted to me, step by step, as far as necessary. Because in that silence, there was a message that transcended forensic science, and it was now my mission to reveal it. And in that commitment, I understood that this was not just another case. It was a sacred duty to the man who fought to the end, and to all those who still hold hope that justice, though slow and imperfect, must always prevail. The following weeks turned into an invisible maze, a dark game where every move could trigger unpredictable consequences. The tension was no longer perceived only in the lost documents or the closed doors. There was a subtle and persistent heat that slipped into every encounter. Every glance exchanged in the hallways, even in the shadows that danced outside my house at nightfall. Early one morning, I discovered that someone had tampered with the security system of my office, but without the intention of taking anything specific. It was a warning, a fearful reminder that my steps were being watched. Paranoia began to embrace me tightly. Not out of fear of death, but fear of the silence that might follow if I abandoned my search. Still, I could not allow that inner alarm to dictate my pace. I had come too far, and the responsibility was not mine alone. It was a collective commitment, the voice of a man who could no longer speak, and of those who could be the next victims if we remained silent. I then returned to the hidden sheet, that enigmatic letter concealed in the sleeve, with renewed determination. Every line, every symbol seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if simply reading it unveiled fragments of a truth too vast to be contained. I sought connections, subtle patterns that common sense overlooked, trying to decipher whether behind each number and initial there was a more human message, an inadvertent confession, or perhaps a cry for help. On one of those long and silent nights, when the city slumbered under a blanket of stars and distant lights, the unexpected call from the young engineer broke the stillness. There were new revelations. Her words came halting, tinged with urgency and fear. Those suspicious failures she mentioned earlier were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a deliberate pattern of technical sabotage aimed at forcing a hidden shutdown, an excuse to transfer control of the plant to third parties with opaque interests. Every time someone tried to intervene or correct course, they found inexplicable blockages, unauthorized works, damaged or replaced parts with no record. She also confided that she had detected anomalous movements in the economic balances, entries that disappeared or diverted under false names, names that she and I already knew thanks to that hidden letter. My heart pounded as I listened to that trembling but firm voice. I understood that I was not merely investigating crime. I was unearthing a web of corruption affecting the lives, health, and safety of thousands of people. It was not only the scientific evidence or engineering that had led me there, but the discovery that behind every technical failure was a hand trying to manipulate the truth for personal gain. That explained the pressures, the disappearance of data, and the complicit silences. But it also gave a painful explanation for the fate of the man I had found dead. It had not been a mistake or an accident, but a consequence of confronting that invisible monster. My investigation then became a dangerous balance between moving forward and protecting those who collaborated with me. The anonymous messages stopped being mere warnings and became clear and direct threats. It was not only my family who received hostile looks. I myself was intercepted one night by a stranger who let fall a cryptic warning and vanished into the shadows before I could react. It was a moment that froze me because I understood I was too close to the core, but I also knew that stepping back was not an option. The cold wind blowing that night even seemed to want to remind me that uncertainty and danger were part of the cost of seeking the truth. In a gesture I now see as a turning point, I decided to accept the help of an old colleague, an ethical hacker who knew the digital guts better than anyone in our city. Together, we took on the challenge of digging into the plant's computer systems, looking for those economic and technical irregularities that only an expert could detect. What we discovered far exceeded any initial suspicion. Not only were there records of physical sabotage attempts, but also campaigns of digital manipulation to alter maintenance reports, erase inspection records, and create artificial failures that did not exist, all to justify questionable administrative decisions. The complexity and sophistication of that network made it evident that we were facing a well-organized group with considerable resources. To avoid alerting those watching us, we worked at night, exchanging information on secure platforms and coordinating meetings with extreme caution. Meanwhile, the media began to pick up some threads of our story, thanks to the courage and professionalism of journalists with whom we shared the data confidentially. It was the beginning of a silent domino effect. Public pressure started to grow without the corrupt power being able to stop it completely, and with it, new voices felt encouraged to speak under protection of increasing social attention. Until then, hidden fears and tiny internal rebellions began to surface, and the clandestine support network grew, providing important pieces that help assemble a puzzle too big to ignore. But, inexorably, the tension rose like the tide in a storm. On one occasion, a secret meeting was interrupted by noises we had not anticipated. An unknown patrol, probably sent by those who want to bury all evidence and silence anyone who came too close. It was a moment where adrenaline stole my breath and reminded me that, on the other side, we faced a wall of ruthless and unscrupulous will. There was no physical violence, only cold stares and the implicit threat that this entire search could have an irreversible cost. Still, the solidarity among us grew stronger. Beyond fear, every step taken bore the weight of a silent pact, to move forward no matter the cost. On a gray Monday, while reviewing again the hidden sheet that had triggered everything, I noticed a line I had not seen before, a small symbol next to a date, almost imperceptible, but matching several key events of the sabotage. It was not a code nor a technical number, but a sort of personal mark, a seal pointing to someone very close to the victim, someone who had played a role in the chain of death and cover-up without being discovered until now. That revelation completely changed the direction of the investigation. We were no longer looking only for an external aggressor or a systemic failure. Now, we had to face the possibility of internal betrayal, a familiar face acting from the shadows to protect dark interests. The pressure on me and the circle surrounding the investigation grew exponentially. The threats became more explicit and executive, and I felt the gaze of danger so close that sometimes I woke up unable to move, trapped between the thought of protecting or exposing more evidence. Despite that, I decided to accelerate the release of reports and proofs, convinced that the truth, when it gains enough light, becomes unstoppable. It was an act of faith as much as strategy, because I knew the system could try to stop it, but that citizen participation and public opinion were our best weapons against impunity. Then, just as I began to glimpse a possible turning point, something unexpected happened. During a secret inspection at the plant, with the help of some specialists, we found a hidden room, a space that did not appear on any official blueprint. There, among abandoned equipment and dusty files, we discovered irrefutable evidence of massive manipulation, altered records, chemicals stored without control, and most disturbing of all, a personal diary of the deceased technician. Its pages were filled with confessions, names, dates, and feelings, a heartbreaking compendium detailing not only the technical facts, but also his internal struggle, his fears, and the loneliness of knowing that the truth he held was destined to be buried with him. Reading that diary was like hearing a voice from beyond, a call for justice, a shadow of hope in a sea of corruption and silence. It also contained clues that would open new paths of investigation, hints about undercover collaborators, and people who could still decide to change the course of history. From that moment on, the investigation took on a different rhythm, loaded not only with data, code, and technical evidence, but with profound human commitment to that man who, unknowingly, had left the tools so his sacrifice would not be in vain. But reality also hit hard. We were not just four on a solitary crusade. Behind us, out there, were very powerful interests willing to do anything to maintain their share of power and silence. The line between justice and threat was constantly blurred, and the question haunting my soul was how much I was willing to sacrifice so that the truth could see the light. Some nights, looking at the empty sleeve of the uniform, I felt that letter like a reliquary, a kind of moral compass reminding me that I was not alone, that the story of that man was also the story of all of us. While I tried to maintain a balance between caution and disclosure, social pressure forced reluctant authorities to open official investigations, though biased and controlled, but enough to wear down that perpetual silence network. At the same time, citizens began to mobilize, small protests demanding not only answers, but concrete actions to prevent history from repeating itself. It was a collective awakening that filled me with hope. Because truth does not live in closed offices or shadows, but in the strength of those who dare to listen and act. At that moment, I understood something crucial. This was not just a story of corruption, sabotage, or death. It was a story of resistance, of the human capacity to demand justice when systems fail, when structures become corrupt. That letter in the sleeve, that small forgotten document, was actually a symbol of struggle, a silent call inviting whoever found it never to give up, to keep digging with patience and courage until light emerged from the abyss. And so, as dawn dyed the buildings and streets orange, I felt a strange relief mixed with fear. I knew that danger was still lurking and that this battle had just begun, but also that we were leaving indelible marks. I could not foresee what would come next, what the outcome would be, but I did know that the story of the man with the hidden letter in his sleeve would not die with him. That story would keep beating in every act of courage, in every truth revealed, and in every step taken toward a future where justice was not just an ideal, but a tangible reality. And as I write these lines, I tell you, my friend, with the certainty that the answer lies in never keeping silent, in keeping alive that flame that a silent body left us. Because the truth, even when hidden in darkness, always finds a way to light up the world. Little by little, those clues and documents began to weave a thicker and darker web than I ever imagined. Internal betrayal was not just a remote possibility. It was a tangible reality that forcefully knocked on doors I had until then believed were closed forever. The symbol, that almost imperceptible mark next to the date, was a silent signature, a reminder that amid systemic corruption someone had decided to save themselves at the expense of others. That revelation unleashed not only a storm of suspicion and distrust, but also drove a more frantic search for names, faces, and motives. With the help of my hacker colleague, our nights turned into endless vigils, scrutinizing databases, recovering damaged files, and cross-referencing hidden information in encrypted emails. The digital laboratory environment where we worked was cold and silent, but mentally it burned with an intensity that wore down body and mind alike. Every finding was a blow, a new piece fitting into the puzzle, while simultaneously raising more questions. There was someone who had known how to use their position to divert resources and manipulate the machinery from within, using confusion caused by external sabotage as a mask. As days turned into weeks, the pressure grew with an almost physical force. Threats that once felt distant began to materialize in firm messages and clear gestures. The flat tire on my car, an anonymous call at dawn, the figure disappearing into the shadows of an alley when I tried to follow. That was when I understood that this investigation was not just skimming the surface, but had gone straight to the very heart of a network many wanted to keep hidden at all costs. However, I also realized I had unexpected allies. The journal, that relic found in the secret room, had mobilized not only journalists but technicians, former employees, and ordinary people who saw their own helplessness reflected in that tragedy and decided to act. There was a moment, unforgettable and almost cinematic, when the tension exploded stronger than ever. One dawn, while reviewing some documents in the office, I received an urgent alert. A fire had broken out at the plant, in a strategic area where crucial evidence was supposed to have been stored. It was no accident. I knew instantly when I saw strange movements on security cameras minutes before, hooded figures ready to extinguish any possibility of evidence. The night became a trap, a macabre dance where every second counted to save data and preserve the truth. My mind kept recalling the figure of the fallen technician, his solitary struggle, and I understood that his legacy was now at risk of being consumed by those flames seeking to extinguish justice. But it was also a revealing moment because, despite the chaos, the support network we had built responded with unexpected strength and coordination. Rescue teams, volunteers, and some civil organizations managed to save much of material that seemed lost. It was as if memory itself refused to disappear, as if the dead and silent body of the man in that uniform had become a symbol of resistance that transcended threats and fire. Meanwhile, in the streets, news of the sabotage, corruption, and attempt to destroy evidence began to spread, and with it grew popular outrage. With this new energy, the investigation took on a broader, but also more dangerous dimension. Betrayal within the team was confirmed when someone close tried to block access to certain files, placing obstacles and false arguments to halt progress. The wear, both physical and emotional, became palpable, and every new discovery was an added risk. I often wondered how much longer I could bear the strain, how much I could protect my family and allies without succumbing to pressure. However, I learned something valuable in all this. It's not just about individuals fighting alone, but the collective strength that emerges when injustice is too great to ignore. One of those long nights, while reviewing the technician's journal looking for something we hadn't detected before, I came across a note that even surprised my old friend, the hacker. It mentioned a name, a person who seemed to be on the edge, someone integral to technical management, and at the same time capable of affecting important administrative decisions. The most disturbing thing was that this person appeared in records under a double identity, a mask game that had allowed the real culprits to act with impunity for so long. It was time to confront that familiar face, to pull them out of the shadows and into the light to answer for it. The meeting with that person, when it finally took place in the context of negotiation and confrontation, was one of the tensest episodes of this whole story. There were no shouts or outright accusations, but cold and calculated exchange where words and silences weighed like bullets. What was heard in that room revealed more than confessions. It was a demonstration of a web of complicity that went far beyond what I had imagined. It spoke of deals sealed with economic interests, legal omissions not out of oversight, but by will, of lives that never mattered in the equation, only numbers and power. But a weakness also emerged, a crack in that armor, exposing fragility of a system designed to protect the perverse. Meanwhile, public pressure, encouraged by joint work with brave journalists, continued to rise. Citizen mobilizations grew in number and strength, and the voices demanding transparency and accountability could no longer be ignored. However, those running the corrupt network began to maneuver more aggressively, deploying smear campaigns and indirect threats aimed at undermining the investigators' confidence and provoking fractures within our unit. It was a place where fear trampled heavily, but where an unbeatable solidarity also emerged, the certainty that truth is sought not only with evidence but with joint conviction and courage. Amid all this, the image of that man with his sleeve rolled up became clearer and more symbolic. The hidden letter, the silent struggle he led, became a banner. I think about how often the deepest truths and bravest resistances come in small actions, in unnoticed details that only an attentive eye can rescue. It is the urgency to read between the lines, not to accept official versions without questioning them, to remember that every body, every word, carries a complex and profound story. That man, who certainly died with him, now lived in our hands and in the commitment of those of us who chose to carry on. One day, feeling more certain of what we had uncovered, I decided to share with a small circle of collaborators a fragment of the journal that reflected not only techniques and mistakes, but also the intimate emotions of that technician. There was fear, yes, but also a clear awareness of what was at stake and a faint hope, almost a prayer, that someone would hear his message. That testimony humanized the story, distancing it from mere numbers and processes to transform it into a genuine, almost sacred quest that needed to be respected and completed. In that shared silence, I understood that we were doing more than an investigation. We were honoring a life with every step taken. As the pieces continued to fit together, other unexpected confessions arrived, timid but decisive statements some employees made in secret, protected by the shadow of public attention. The network was crumbling from within, revealing how years of mingled fear and ambition had allowed a rot that was more human and moral than technological or administrative. Not all was lost, but the path ahead was strewn with obstacles far greater than those faced so far. Institutionalized corruption is a beast that feeds on doubt and silence, and to defeat it requires more than evidence. It requires intention and collective commitment. That is why, when morning found me once again before the hidden page, I thought about how much that simple letter had transformed the way I looked at the case. A folded piece of paper between the seams was not just a technical clue, but a light, a bridge between the visible and the invisible, between personal tragedy and social injustice. That letter taught me not to underestimate any sign, to think of the corpse not only as a lifeless body, but as a voice clamoring for justice, a coded message demanding to be deciphered, so that the same mistakes are not repeated. As I walk toward an uncertain future, the certainty that accompanies me is that this story, like so many others buried by time, has the power to transform realities if we are capable of listening carefully and acting bravely. Truth is not a final destination, but a path built step by step, with mistakes, fears, and also alliances that emerge from the darkness. Each one of us carries within that hidden letter that can make a difference, that can ignite the flame that challenges impunity and injustice. That is why today I tell you this, my friend, because beyond the weariness, beyond fear and threats, the story of the technician and that letter in the sleeve remains alive, not only in my hands or in the recovered documents, but in all of us who choose not to close our eyes, in those who make noise when all seems silent, in those who believe that justice, although often delayed, always finds a way to bloom. And although this chapter is not over yet, and danger still lurks, I know that the light that began with that small folded paper will not go out, because the truth, when sought with heart and an open mind, is able to penetrate the densest shadows and illuminate even the most unexpected place. The following morning arrived heavy with a strange silence, one that weighs more than any noise. I looked again at the folded note in the sleeve of the uniform, as if all the weight of the case I was handling gathered in it. It was not just a technical record, nor a simple document. It was a testimony wrapped in paper, a letter without an addressee that crossed time hidden, waiting for a precise moment to be read. As I held it, something became clear. That story would not end with an official closure or with the fall of one or two culprits. It was deeper, more twisted, and the shadow it cast reached corners I had never even imagined looking into. That day, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Upon thoroughly reviewing the names associated with the technician's notes, links appeared to other areas that previously seemed disconnected. It was not just corruption. It was a multi-partite network involving police bodies, government offices, and, surprisingly, prominent members of the local community. The complexity of the scheme overwhelmed me, but it also pushed me to continue. I knew that stopping would mean being complicit in so much silence harm. Every record, every small piece of data, was a card lifting the veil and bringing me closer to the hidden truth. We then faced the greatest difficulty: the invisible connections protecting those responsible. The files, seemingly harmless, had been used to maintain the balance of a corrupt machine that devoured those who dared to challenge it. It was at that stage that I understood the importance of not only being a forensic expert of the body, but also an archaeologist of memory and a detective of silences. Every small mark, every irregularity in the documents, was a window into that hidden past, an invitation not to accept what seemed obvious at first sight. As the team we had formed grew stronger against wear and tear, threats increased in frequency and intensity. One night, upon leaving the laboratory, the blurred figure of someone approached too quickly. There were no words, only a cold brush against the back pocket of my coat. Upon arriving home and checking, I found an unmarked envelope with old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a note that read, "Not everyone wants you to see the truth. Be careful." The chill I felt was not only physical. I knew we were treading on minefield, and that every step could be the last. Yet, there was no room for resignation, only to raise our guard, devise smarter strategies, and protect those who, like me, had joined this fight with claws and teeth. Days later, we discovered a clue no one had foreseen, a coded message hidden in a seemingly random series of numbers within the technician's uniform record. The skill with which that information had been camouflaged reflected deep knowledge, and a firm will preserve some truth at all costs. It was a hacker who, amid silences and tired glances, unraveled the key, addresses, codes, locations. Everything led to a place that until then had not been suspect, an old abandoned facility on the outskirts of San Jose, where, according to old testimonies, acts were committed that had been tried to be erased with fire and oblivion. We quickly organized an operation to access that area. The night we arrived was dense, charged with tension and caution. What we found there was a mixture of desolation and revelation. Among rubble and still legible files, there were hidden cameras and documents pointing to decisions made in the shadows, always far from public scrutiny. Every page, every element, told a story of manipulation, of lives sacrificed to interests fed by fear and greed. It was a direct blow to the heart of the network, but also an invitation to understand the real extent of that silent tragedy that began with a technician and a uniform. As we reviewed the findings, a new enigma began to flood my mind. What was the true role of that technician? Just an involuntary correspondent, or someone who, with minimal gestures like the letter in the sleeve, had tried to be the messenger of a greater truth? The collected testimonies, the drip-feed confessions, and the gathered data painted a complex portrait. A man trapped between his ethics and the system that oppressed him, who decided, in his last days, to leave clues that only a capable eye could follow. His bravery, silent and almost invisible, was a warning and a call not to let the sacrifice be forgotten. The tension outside the offices was also palpable. Public opinion was divided between those fervently demanding justice and those who, fearful, preferred to stay silent and look the other way. The protests did not stop, and with them social tensions grew. The media, some still free, became powerful allies in keeping the flame of demand alive. But there were also attempts to discredit the work, to turn the investigators into villains or exaggerators. It was a battleground where not only facts were debated, but also loyalties and the future of society beginning to awaken. Amid all this turmoil, the folded letter in the uniform sleeve became a symbol that exceeded its physical presence. It was not just a piece of paper. It was the crossroads where past and present faced off, where the memory of one man joined with the commitment of many. The small note held the essence of struggle against indifference, a reminder that details often hide the most necessary truths. Every time I looked at it, I felt the weight of responsibility beyond my profession. It was a call to persist, to be the voice of those who could no longer speak. The battle was far from over. It was not closure I expected, but a new beginning marked by constant risks, doubts, and contradictions, but also by lessons and unexpected alliances woven in the heat of resistance. With every step, with every document unraveled, with every testimony collected, the story of that technician and his invisible letter became a faint light, but one growing brighter, challenging the darkness that tried to consume it. I still clearly remember a phrase I repeated to myself those days, almost like a mantra. Truth lives in the details, and the details live in those who seek it. Today, as I tell you this, I do not know what the next chapter will be or how many more letters await to be found among folds of fabric or forgotten pages. But I do know that this fight is still there, latent, and that as long as there is a soul willing to listen and act, no shadow can extinguish the flame that began with a folded note in the sleeve of a uniform and the silence of a man who chose to leave a legacy. This story is neither mine nor that of the lonely technician. It is the story of all those who once felt the weight of injustice, but decided not to yield before it. It is the story of a country, of a society that refuses to be silenced. And although the path continues in darkness, with risks and moments of despair, the certainty I hold is that truth, when sought with sincere heart and an open mind, always finds a way to be heard. May that folded and hidden letter remain a beacon for those of us willing not to stay silent. Because sometimes the most powerful message is locked in the smallest detail, and it is up to us to decipher it so that, finally, justice can bloom.